All right, let's go. Number 11. The stones set into living teeth. In museum drawers across Mexico, Guatemala, and Belize, there are human front teeth with small discs set into their outer faces. Some are green. Some are the color of gold. The green ones are jade. The gold-colored ones are pyrite, iron sulfide, ground and polished until they hold a shine. Each stone sits in a round socket cut into the enamel, flush with the surface, held by a cement that in more than half of surviving cases has still not let go after 1,000 years. The people who wore them were Maya, and the practice runs through the Classic period, roughly 250 to 900 in the Common Era, across the lowlands. The stone was usually set into the incisors and canines, the teeth that show when a person speaks. Vera Tiesler, who has worked on Maya dental modification for decades, has recorded the marks on as many as 60% of adults at some sites. It was ordinary. In most cases, it appears to have been done as a passage into adulthood. The procedure is where the ordinary turns into something harder. To set a stone in a tooth, a craftsman first cut a shallow starter pit so the drill point would not skate across the enamel, then drilled a round cavity, then shaped a stone to fit it and cemented it in place. Enamel is one of the hardest materials the body makes. The drill was almost certainly tipped with obsidian and turned by hand, and no such tool has ever been recovered from a Maya site, because a point fine enough to do this work is fine enough to be lost. What makes this difficult is the depth. The cavity had to pass through the enamel and into the dentine beneath it, and then it had to stop. A few millimeters further in lies the pulp, the living core of nerves and blood vessels. Open the pulp and the tooth begins to die. The wound turns septic, and in a world without antibiotics, that infection can kill. The surviving teeth show that the people doing this understood where the line was. Scans of the interiors reveal calcification in the pulp chamber, mineral laid down as a slow, defensive reaction to the drilling above it. That reaction only occurs in a living tooth. The work was done on people who were awake. Then there is the cement. Analysis of the material holding the stones has shown it was not a simple glue. It was an organic compound, and it carried antibacterial and anti-inflammatory properties. It sealed the stone. It was colored to match, and it appears to have protected the drilled cavity from precisely the infection the drilling invited. More than half of the modified teeth recovered from Maya graves still have their inlays seated, which means the cement outlasted the person, the burial, and the centuries of decay that came after. For a long time, this was read as pure ornament, a matter of status confined to the teeth that showed. In 2026, that reading was complicated. Researchers described a molar with a stone set into it, a tooth hidden at the back of the mouth that does not appear when a person smiles, which is hard to explain by appearance alone, and has reopened the question of whether some of this work was meant to treat a tooth rather than adorn it. The stones are still in the drawers, and most of them are still seated. A green disc, cut to fit a hole in a stranger's tooth, sealed by a hand that knew how deep to go and stopped in time, holding 1,000 years after the mouth around it was gone. Number 10. The gold that stood in for a tooth. In the collections of the National Museum of Denmark, in Copenhagen, there is a band of gold shaped to fit the front of a human jaw. It is a thin strip, soldered into a loop, sized to slip over several standing teeth and grip them, and mounted within it is a replacement tooth. It came out of the ground in central Italy, and it is roughly 2,500 years old. Objects like it are Etruscan. The Etruscans occupied what is now Tuscany and Lazio in the centuries before Rome absorbed them, and they were exceptional goldsmiths. The earliest of these dental appliances, a band of nearly pure gold, was excavated at Satricum and dates to around 630 BC. That places the dental bridge, the device that anchors a false tooth to the sound teeth on either side of a gap, more than 2,000 years before the modern version of it. Only about 20 are documented from Etruscan contexts, and of those, 9 survive. Several were recorded in the 19th century and then lost. Marshall Becker and Jean McIntosh Turfa, who assembled the full history of these objects, worked out both how they were made and what they were for. A band was fitted around the standing teeth. Into it went a replacement, and here the material is worth pausing on. Sometimes it was a tooth carved from ivory or bone. Sometimes it was a real human tooth, riveted into the band with a gold pin. In a number of cases, the replacement had been taken from another mouth. The false tooth that restored a wealthy Etruscan smile had, in these examples, once belonged to someone else. Becker gave this a blunt name: recycling in antiquity. Where the replacement tooth came from, whether bought, taken from the dead, or pulled from the living, the sources do not say, and the appliance itself cannot tell us. The metalwork around it, though, is telling in another way. Drawing gold into fine wire and soldering it cleanly was demanding craft, and the Etruscans were doing it here for the mouth, before the technique for refining gold to high purity is thought to have spread through the wider Mediterranean. The skill arrived early, and it was pointed, among other things, at appearances. The choice of gold turns out to have been more than display. Gold does not corrode, and it is inert in the wet, acidic environment of the mouth. It sat against living tissue for years without poisoning it, which is one reason these appliances could stay in place. The bands were fitted to be worn continuously, and the wear on some of them shows they were. What they were not is functional in the way a modern bridge is. Becker and Turfa are direct about this. The appliances were not strong enough for heavy chewing, and their purpose was cosmetic. Almost all of the securely identified examples come from the graves of women. In a society where these women appeared in public with visible standing, a gap in the front teeth was closed with gold and a borrowed tooth, and the gold was left showing. Then Rome absorbed Etruria, and the technique disappeared. Nothing quite like these gold band bridges appears again in the Western record for well over 1,000 years. The knowledge did not evolve into something better. It simply stopped. The appliances that survive sit in museum cases in Europe, a few centimeters of gold with a tooth held inside. The metal is untarnished because it was chosen to be. The smile it completed and the second person it was quietly assembled from are both long gone. Number 9. The iron pin in the Celtic grave. At Lachine, in the Aube region of northern France, a timber-lined burial chamber was excavated that dated to the 3rd century BC. Inside was a young woman, and she had been buried with wealth: a bronze belt hung with brooches, a bronze bracelet and ring, a pair of iron shears. Nearby graves held necklaces of coral and amber. She belonged to the Celtic elite of Iron Age Gaul. Her skeleton had decayed badly, but her teeth had held their positions in the jaw. 31 of them were where they should be: molars and premolars and canines and incisors in anatomical order. Among them was a 32nd object that was not a tooth. It was a small pin of iron, corroded, sitting at the front of the upper jaw, exactly where a central incisor belonged. The archaeologist Guillaume Seguin, who excavated the burial, described the moment plainly. The teeth were in position, and then there was this piece of metal, and the first reaction was simply to ask what it was. The answer, published in the journal Antiquity in 2014, is that the pin has the same dimensions and shape as the woman's own incisors, and that it stood in the place of one. It appears to be a dental implant, and it is the oldest known example in Western Europe. The pin itself would not have been the finished tooth. The most likely reconstruction is that the iron acted as a post, driven into the socket or into the root canal of the lost tooth, and that a false crown of some perishable material, carved wood or ivory, was fixed over it. Wood and ivory do not survive 2,300 years in the ground. The iron did. The reason for it was probably the same reason people choose a front tooth today. The central incisor is one of the most visible teeth in the mouth. Losing it changes a face. Seguin's view is that the intention here was aesthetic, and that this woman, or the people around her, wanted the gap closed. But the object carries a difficulty that will not resolve, and it is a serious one. Iron corrodes inside the body, and a corroding piece of metal driven into a tooth socket is an invitation to infection that, in the Iron Age, could have been fatal. Whether the pin was placed while she was alive and endured, or whether it was fitted after death as part of preparing her body for burial, cannot be settled from the remains. Driving it into living bone would have been agonizing, and if there was pain relief, it came from a plant. The candidate for that relief is the kind of thing later cultures reached for as well. Willow bark carries salicin, the natural forerunner of the compound in aspirin, and it grew within reach. Whether it was used here is unknown. What is clearer is the world the object sits in. The grave is one of a group of richly furnished women's burials excavated at Lachine, and by the late Iron Age, kits of surgical instruments turn up in graves across Europe, from Britain to the Carpathians. The people of this period were setting bones, closing wounds, and in at least this one case, fitting a piece of metal where a tooth had been. The pin belongs to a moment when the deliberate repair of the body was becoming something a specialist did. What remains is the pin, in its position, in a jaw whose owner was laid out with shears to cut her hair and coral at her throat. A sliver of iron where a tooth should be, precise enough to be deliberate, and silent on the one question that matters most about it. Number 8. Hesire. On the wall of a mud brick tomb at Saqqara, the great cemetery outside Memphis, a man is carved into cedar. He is shown seated and standing, lean, holding the tools of a scribe. The panels are among the finest wooden reliefs to survive from early Egypt. The tomb is one of the largest of its period, and it belonged to a court official who lived under the pharaoh Djoser in the 3rd dynasty around 2670 BC. His name was Hesire. Among his many titles, carved beside his image, is one written Weribe Senja. It is usually translated as Chief of Dentists and Physicians, or Great One of those who deal with teeth. There is a genuine argument about the reading. The same signs can be taken to mean Great One of the Ivory Cutters. But the weight of scholarly opinion places him with teeth, and if that reading holds, Hesire is the earliest individual in human history known by name to have practiced dentistry. The title tells us something on its own. To have a chief of dentists, distinct from a chief of physicians, is to have a recognized specialism. Egypt was already sorting its healers by the part of the body they treated, and Egyptian medicine was written down. The medical papyri that survive, the Ebers papyrus foremost among them, contain remedies aimed directly at the mouth, prescriptions for loose teeth, for inflamed gums, for the pain of an aching tooth, compounded from minerals, plants, and honey, and packed against the problem. What actually worked in that tradition is where the picture has to be handled with care. The Egyptians pulled teeth, and the jaws they left behind show sockets that healed cleanly after a tooth was lost, which means people survived extraction and recovered from it. The remedies were real, and some of their ingredients had genuine effect. That much the evidence supports. The Ebers papyrus, copied around 1550 BC from older material, is the longest of the surviving medical rolls, and its prescriptions for the mouth are specific. Paste to firm a loosening tooth, mixtures to quiet an inflamed gum, compounds carried on honey and packed against an ache. The demand for them was real because Egyptian teeth suffered. Bread in Egypt was ground on stone, and the flour it produced carried grit and wind-blown sand that wore the enamel flat over a lifetime, exposing the soft core of the tooth and opening the way to abscesses. The jaws of kings and commoners alike are full of ground-down crowns, teeth lost in life, and the hollows in the bone that infection leaves behind. For all the wealth of the Nile, the dental record it left is largely a record of pain that the physicians could soften, but not cure. But here's where a famous claim has to be set aside. For a century, popular accounts of Egyptian dentistry have leaned on two objects. A specimen from near the Great Pyramid at Giza, in which two molars are bound together with gold wire and described as a bridge, and a passage in another papyrus read as instructions to drill through the jaw to drain an abscess. Both have been challenged by specialists. The gold wire molars are now widely regarded as more likely a funerary object, an amulet, than a working appliance fitted in life. The supposed drill hole for the abscess is better explained as a natural channel through which such an abscess drains on its own, with no surgery involved at all. The reputation of Egyptian dental surgery has run some distance ahead of the hardware that survives to support it. So the record leaves a careful residue. It gives us the first person known to have carried the title, and a written pharmacy of dental care, and jaws that healed after teeth were pulled. It does not give us the elaborate dental engineering that the reputation promises. What survives most securely of Hesiri is Hesiri himself, cut into cedar on a tomb wall, the oldest name in the profession, holding a scribe's palette rather than a tool for the mouth. Number 7. The front teeth that were taken on purpose. At the back of a cave in the mountains of eastern Morocco, 150 or so people were buried over the last stretch of the Ice Age. The cave is Grotte des Pigeons at Taforalt, and the burials belong to the Ibero-Mauritans, hunter-gatherers of the Maghreb, dated to somewhere between 15,000 and 12,500 years ago. Their skulls share a feature that is impossible to miss once it has been pointed out. The upper front teeth are gone, and the bone where they sat has grown over and closed. This is not decay, and it is not the ordinary loss of age. The upper central incisors have been deliberately removed. At Taforalt, more than 9 in 10 adults show it. The same is true at the Ibero-Mauritian cemetery of Affalot, across the border in Algeria. Across this whole culture, the removal of the front teeth was very nearly universal. The evidence that it was done during life, and not to the dead, is written in the sockets. When a tooth is pulled from a living jaw, the empty socket slowly fills with new bone and remodels, and that healing is visible under study. The healed sockets at Taforalt vary. Some are freshly closed, some fully remodeled, which tells the researchers something specific. The teeth were not all taken at one moment in a person's life. Louise Humphrey and her colleagues, who have worked through these collections, read the pattern as a practice that people underwent more than once, at different ages, tied to stages of life, rather than a single event. The consequences of taking those teeth were not small. Losing both upper central incisors changes how the remaining teeth meet and wear, and over generations it left a mark on the shape of the lower jaw itself. Early researchers at Taforalt noticed a distinctive raising of the bone at the front of the mandible in people who had undergone it. It also took away part of what the front teeth are for. The incisors are what a mouth uses to grip and tear, and removing them shifted that work onto the teeth behind. These were people already contending with heavy wear and widespread decay, and they chose to surrender the biting edge of the mouth as well. The practice held for thousands of years and spread across the Maghreb, from Morocco into Algeria and beyond, softening only much later as the region moved toward herding and farming. Removing a healthy tooth is difficult, and it hurts. The front teeth are single-rooted, which makes them the more feasible ones to take. But a person doing this had to grip, work the tooth loose against its ligament, and pull with no anesthetic and stone tools. And it was done to children as well as adults. The people of Taforalt were also carrying serious dental disease from a diet heavy in wild starchy plants. More than half of their surviving teeth show cavities, which is extraordinarily high for hunter-gatherers. Into that mouth of aching, decaying molars, the culture added the deliberate removal of the sound teeth at the front. The purpose was not medical. Nothing about pulling healthy incisors treats decay elsewhere. This was a mark carried on the face, a modification of the visible self that everyone in the group shared, and its meaning belonged to them and did not survive with the bone. What can be recovered is that it worked in the narrow and literal sense that matters here. The wounds closed, the jaws remodeled, and people lived on for years with the gap. The same cave has produced the earliest known case anywhere of a person surviving a hole cut into the skull. These were people who opened the body deliberately, at the head and at the mouth, and whose patients healed. The skulls are in museum collections now, rows of faces missing their front teeth, the bone grown smooth over the absence, and no record left of why the absence was worth making. Number 6. Krapina. The site is a sandstone rock shelter on the bank of a small river in northern Croatia, and it holds the largest collection of Neanderthal remains found anywhere, some 900 fragments of bone and tooth from between roughly 23 and 35 individuals, laid down around 130,000 years ago. Among all that material are 4 teeth from the lower left side of one Neanderthal's mouth, 3 molars and a premolar, and they carry a set of marks that fit together into a single small story. David Freyer and colleagues examined them and found 3 things at once. There are grooves running along the sides of the teeth, at the gum line, of the kind left by pushing a pointed object repeatedly into the same gap. There are scratches on one of the teeth, and 2 of the teeth have been pushed out of their normal alignment. Taken together, the researchers read this as one individual working at a persistent problem in that corner of the mouth, using a toothpick of bone or wood, probing and prodding at teeth that were out of position and in all likelihood hurting. Toothpicking itself is old, older than Neanderthals. The telltale grooves it leaves have been found on the teeth of much earlier members of the human line, going back to some of the first of our genus. Reaching into your own mouth to relieve discomfort is close to the oldest deliberate act of self-care we can trace. The behavior is not even confined to our line. Living monkeys have been watched using stems and hairs to clean between their teeth, which suggests the impulse runs deeper than any single species. What lifts the Crapina teeth above simple habit is the way the marks assemble. Freyer's team described the grooves, the scratches, and the shifted teeth as a package that fits together, the trace of a dental problem the individual was trying to manage rather than a stray gesture. And it is not the only sign that these people attended to their bodies. Elsewhere in the Neanderthal record, chemical traces caught in dental tartar have been read as the residue of medicinal plants, including one that carries the active compound in aspirin. The picture that has been forming for years is of a people who noticed pain and did something about it. Crapina is one of the earliest windows onto that. What sets Crapina apart is that here the toothpicking is bound up with a specific dental complaint, a set of displaced and irritated teeth, and reads not as idle habit, but as an attempt to do something about pain. That distinction is the whole point of the entry, and it is worth being exact about. This is not surgery. Nobody drilled anything. Nobody removed anything. Nobody opened a tooth. A Neanderthal poked at its own sore gums with a splinter, over and over, in the way anyone does when a tooth will not stop nagging. But it is deliberate. It is aimed at a problem the individual could feel, and it is 130,000 years old. Before there was any tool put to a tooth, there was this. There is a limit to what 4 teeth can tell. We do not know whether the effort helped, or whether the tooth eventually settled or fell or festered. We know only that someone kept returning to the same spot with the same intent, long enough to leave the record of it in the enamel. The teeth are curated in Zagreb, with the rest of the vast Crapina collection. 4 worn teeth from one side of one jaw, marked by a hand reaching in from outside to work at an ache, before our species existed to inherit the habit. Number 5. The jaw in the Trieste Museum. In the Natural History Museum of Trieste, on the northeastern edge of Italy, there is a piece of a human lower jaw that spent decades misdated and largely ignored. It was found in the 1930s, embedded in calcite, on the wall of a karst cave near the village of Lonca, just across the border in southern Slovenia. It was assumed, from the animal bones around it, to be very old and set aside with a short note. It is the left half of an adult mandible, carrying a canine, 2 premolars, and 2 molars. The teeth are worn, and the canine is the worst of them. Running down through it is a deep vertical crack, splitting the enamel and reaching into the dentine, the kind of fracture that would have made the tooth painful to bite on and sensitive to anything cold. Long before the jaw reached a laboratory, someone had done something about that crack. A team led by Federico Bernardini and Claudio Tuniz put the tooth through synchrotron imaging, infrared analysis, and radiocarbon dating, and reported the result in 2012. The dating pulled the jaw forward from its assumed antiquity to around 6,500 years old, into the Neolithic, when this corner of the Adriatic was occupied by a culture of sheep herders, and the imaging found, filling the crack in the exposed patch of worn dentine, a foreign material. It was beeswax. The wax had been packed into the fracture, sealing over the sensitive tissue. The identification did not come easily, and the methods matter, because a claim like this needs them. The jaw was scanned with a synchrotron, a light source powerful enough to map the wax layer inside the tooth at the scale of microns, and its distribution was exact. It filled the shallow, worn hollow in the dentine and the upper part of the crack, and stopped where the damage stopped. Infrared analysis and electron microscopy identified the substance as beeswax, and radiocarbon dating fixed its age. One uncertainty remains, and the researchers state it plainly. The wax could have been applied in the last days of the man's life or shortly after his death, and the two would mean different things: the treatment of a living patient or a gesture made to a body. If it was done in life, it is the act of someone trying to keep a broken tooth in service. For several years after it was published, it stood as the oldest dental filling on record, until the older Italian teeth displaced it. If it was done while the man was alive, and the balance of evidence leans that way, the reason is straightforward. A crack that reaches the dentine hurts, and a soft waterproof plug over it would have dulled the sensitivity and kept the tooth usable for chewing. It is, in effect, a filling. For a while after its publication, it stood as the oldest one known. What makes the choice of material worth dwelling on is that it was correct. Beeswax is inert. It is waterproof. It softens to fit and sets in place, and it seals a wound from the mouth without poisoning it. A Neolithic herder, faced with a split tooth and no notion of chemistry, reached for a substance that a modern person would recognize as a reasonable temporary seal. The instinct behind the act, to close over the raw place and stop the pain, is exactly the instinct behind the plastic and porcelain of a filling now. The jaw is a small object in a museum drawer, sat in its calcite for thousands of years, and misunderstood for most of a century after it came out. In the crack of one canine is a dab of wax, put there by someone who wanted to eat without hurting, and it held long enough that we can still see the shape of it. Number 4. The holes drilled 9,000 years ago. At a place called Mehrgar, on the Kachi Plain in what is now Balochistan in Pakistan, lies one of the oldest farming settlements known anywhere, occupied from before 7000 BC. In its graveyard, among some 300 burials, the excavators recovered a set of teeth that changed the timeline of dentistry. 11 molars from 9 different adults, each with a neat hole drilled into the crown. The people were ordinary members of the community. 4 women, 2 men, 3 whose sex could not be determined, ranging from young adulthood into middle age. The holes are in the biting surfaces of the first and second molars, in both the upper and lower jaws. They run from 0.5 millimeter to 3.5 millimeters deep, and inside them, under magnification, are the fine concentric ridges left by a rotating point. The tool was almost certainly a flint drill spun with a bow. The same settlement was making beads by drilling stone and shell with exactly that technology, and the inference is that the skill crossed over. Hands that could drill a bead learned to drill a tooth. Mehrgar is not a marginal place in the story of civilization. It is one of the earliest farming villages in South Asia, settled before 7000 BC, with mud brick houses, storage buildings, cultivated wheat and barley, herded goats and cattle, and workshops turning out beads of shell, steatite, and other stone. The drill heads that made those beads have been found at the site alongside the beads themselves, and they are the obvious candidate for the tool that opened the teeth. It is a picture of a settled community, with time, inherited skill, and specialists, and of dentistry appearing not as a stray idea, but as one use of a technology the village already had in hand. That the drilling was done on the living and not on the dead is the first thing the teeth establish. Some of the holes show wear along their edges, smoothed by chewing after they were cut, which can only happen if the person went on using the tooth. The individuals lived with their drilled molars, in some cases long enough to wear them further. The placement rules out one easy explanation. These holes are deep in the mouth, on the back teeth, on the chewing surfaces where no one would see them. Whatever they were for, it was not display. 4 of the 11 drilled teeth have signs of decay associated with the hole, which points, at least in those cases, toward treatment, an attempt to deal with a rotten tooth by cutting into it. What the drillers did about the exposed cavity afterward is not certain. The open dentine would have needed sealing, and some kind of filling may have followed, though it has not survived to be identified. The scale is what lifts Merger above a single lucky find. This is not one tooth from one accident. It is 9 people, 11 teeth, spread across a graveyard, drilled with a consistent technique over a span of centuries. Something like a tradition of working on teeth existed here, held by a farming community, more than 9,000 years ago. And then, after around 5500 BC, it vanishes from the record at the site, as cleanly as it appeared. Why it stops is not known. The settlement itself went on, and grew, and fed eventually into the great Bronze Age cities of the Indus. But the drilled teeth belong to a window of roughly 1500 years, and once it closes, this particular practice leaves no further trace here. For 3 decades after its discovery, Merger held the record as the oldest evidence anywhere of a tooth drilled in a living mouth, until teeth from Ice Age Italy pushed the origin thousands of years deeper still. The teeth were found by an international team including Roberto Macchiarelli and Alfredo Coppa, and reported in the journal Nature. They are small, ordinary molars from ordinary people, each with a hole in it made by a stone point turning fast, cut into a living mouth by someone who had learned the trick on beads and turned it to the harder problem of a tooth. Number 3. The fillings made of tar. Also in Italy, at a rock shelter called Riparo Fradian in the hills near Lucca, a set of human remains was recovered that carries the practice one step further than anything above it. The pieces that matter are 2 teeth, the upper front incisors, and they belong to a single person who lived at the very end of the Ice Age, directly dated to between 13,000 and 12,700 years ago. Each incisor has a large hole in its biting surface. The holes are not decay, left to run. They go straight down into the pulp chamber, the central cavity of the tooth, and their inner walls carry small horizontal marks. Under the microscope, those marks read as tool work, a pointed instrument, worked into the tooth and twisted, widening the natural cavity and scraping out the dead and infected tissue from inside. This is drilling, done to the front teeth, into the living core. Gregorio Auxilia and Stefano Bonazzi, who led the analysis, then found what had been put into the cleaned-out holes. Lining the inner walls of both cavities was a dark residue, and when it was analyzed, it turned out to be bitumen, a naturally occurring tar. Mixed into the bitumen were plant fibers and what appeared to be hairs. The holes had been drilled to remove the rot, and then packed with a prepared composite substance. That combination is the reason this entry sits where it does. The Merger molars were drilled, and the beeswax at Lance was packed into a crack. Here both halves of the operation are present in the same tooth. The cavity opened and cleaned with a tool, and then a filling material deliberately mixed and pressed into the space. It is, in its essential logic, the same sequence a dentist follows now, and it is more than 12,500 years old. Bitumen is sticky, waterproof, and mildly antiseptic, and the plant fibers may have bound it or added to its effect. Whoever chose it was solving the right problem with the materials at hand. Establishing all of this took a battery of methods. Microcomputed tomography to see inside the teeth, electron microscopy to read the tool marks on the cavity walls, and residue analysis to identify what had filled them. The individual, known in the study as Fradian 5, had both upper front teeth open to the pulp before death, and that is the detail that carries the case. A cavity worked open to the living core, on the most visible teeth in the mouth. does not happen by accident or after burial. It is a procedure, carried out on a person who felt it, to reach and clear the dying tissue that was the source of the pain. Benazzi and his colleagues framed what it meant with restraint. The instinct to treat disease and the practical knowledge to attempt it were in place long before the settled, grain-eating life that was once assumed to have produced them. For a long time, the assumption was that dentistry arrived with farming, that the surge in tooth decay came when people started eating cultivated grain, and that treatment followed the disease. Freudian, together with the tooth that comes after it in this list, breaks that assumption. These were hunter-gatherers. The decay was already rising among them, from wild plants and changing diets, and the response, the drilling and the filling, was already being worked out before anyone farmed anything. That reversal is the quiet weight of these teeth. The standard account set cause and effect in a neat line. Agriculture brings sugar and starch, starch brings decay, decay brings the dentist. The order looked secure because the oldest treated teeth kept surfacing in Neolithic graves. But the Italian shelters hold foragers, and their teeth were already rotting and already being worked on. The climb and decay at the end of the Ice Age came from gathering and grinding wild plants, from acorns and grasses and whatever else the warming land offered, and the people eating them reached the same conclusion a farmer would, and reached it earlier. The drill and the filling did not wait for the farm. The incisors are held in an Italian collection, 2 front teeth from a single Ice Age mouth. Each has a hole cut down to its core, cleaned by a hand working a stone point, and lined with a dark tar mixed with fiber and hair, the oldest filling anyone has yet found. Number 2. Villa Bruna. In 1988, in a rock shelter high in the Venetian Dolomites of northern Italy, the well-preserved skeleton of a young man was excavated. He had lived and died in the late Upper Paleolithic, and direct dating placed him between about 14,100 and 13,800 years ago. His remains have been studied for decades under the name of the shelter, Villa Bruna, and for most of that time, one detail about him went unnoticed. Among his teeth is a lower right wisdom tooth, the third molar, with a large cavity worn into its chewing surface. For years, it was cataloged as exactly that, a cavity, an ordinary case of decay. It was only on re-examination that the cavity turned out to be something more. A team led by Gregorio Auxilia and Stefano Benazzi took the tooth to a scanning electron microscope and looked at the walls of the hole. What they found, inside the cavity and around its rim, was a pattern of striations and chipping in the enamel that decay does not produce. The marks were the record of a pointed stone tool, a small flint microlith, worked into the cavity and drawn across it, scratching and levering at the infected tissue inside. To test it, they took flint and bone points to the enamel of other molars and reproduced the same marks by scraping. The wear on the tooth showed the scratching had been done before the man died. Someone had picked the rot out of the living tooth with a sharpened stone. The cavity was not small. It was a broad opening worn into the crown with several distinct pockets of decay inside it, and it was the striations around and within those pockets that gave the treatment away. Under the microscope, they did not match the smooth, rounded surfaces that ordinary wear and decay leave behind. They were sharp, directional, and uneven, the record of a hard point dragged and levered across the tooth in more than one direction. The experimental work narrowed the tool further. Small blades of flint and points of bone, drawn across fresh enamel, left the closest match. Whoever did this was not chewing on something abrasive or grinding tough food. They were deliberately scraping at the inside of a decayed tooth to clear it. This is the oldest known instance of dentistry anywhere. It predates the drilled molars of Merger by some 5,000 years, and it predates the first written medicine by a great deal more. And it complicates the same tidy story that Freudian complicates. Here is a hunter-gatherer, thousands of years before farming, with a rotten wisdom tooth. And here is the evidence that another person, or the sufferer himself, took a stone point and cleaned it out. The awareness that a decayed tooth could be worked on, that the diseased tissue could be scraped away to ease it, was already present in the Ice Age. There is no filling here, no bitumen, no wax. This is the plainer earlier act. The cavity opened up and cleaned, and nothing more. It is the first move of dentistry, isolated, without the second. For years, none of it was seen. The tooth had been described, catalogued, and stored as a straightforward carious lesion, a natural cavity in an old skeleton, and it took a fresh pair of eyes and a microscope to recognize that the damage had been worked. That is worth holding on to, because it hints at how much of this history has passed unremarked. Paleolithic people were already using picks of bone and wood to clear food from between their teeth. What Villabruna adds is the awareness that a decayed tooth itself could be opened and cleaned, the knowledge that rot could be reached and taken out, rather than only endured, was present in the Ice Age, long before it was written down, or, until recently, even suspected. And it was so unassuming that it hid in plain sight in a cataloged tooth for years, mistaken for the disease it was actually a treatment of. The tooth is held at the University of Ferrara, a single worn wisdom tooth from a young man dead for 14,000 years, its cavity scratched clean by a stone held in a steady hand, the oldest thing our species is known to have done to a tooth. Number 1. The operation older than us. Nearly 60,000 years ago, in a cave in the Altai Mountains of southern Siberia, someone opened up a rotten tooth to reach the decay inside it. The cave is Chagirskaya, and it was not occupied by our species. It was occupied by Neanderthals. The tooth is the oldest evidence of a dental operation found anywhere on Earth, and the people who performed it were gone from the world before the young man at Villabruna was ever born. The tooth is a lower left molar, catalogued Chagirskaya 64. It was pulled out of the cave deposits in 2016, and for years no one was certain what to make of a deep, oddly shaped hollow on its surface. In 2026, a team of researchers reported their conclusion in the journal PLOS One, and it moved the origin of dentistry back by more than 40,000 years in a single step. Two things had been done to the tooth, and the microscope separated them. The molar carried severe decay, a cavity that ran from the crown down toward the pulp, the kind of rot that produces relentless pain. Along one side of the tooth, near the gum line, are the straight grooves of repeated toothpicking, the same signature seen at crapina, the sign of someone worrying at the sore spot with a pointed splinter. And inside the cavity itself are marks of a different kind, scratches and a shaping that the researchers argue were made by a stone tool worked deliberately into the hole to clean out the decayed tissue. Chagirskaya Cave has produced quantities of small, sharp points and perforators worked from jasper, exactly the tools such a job would require. The cave itself is one of the richer Neanderthal sites in Asia. Its occupants belonged to a population with deep roots in the region, and they left behind not only bones, but a whole toolkit napped from local stone, including the fine points that could have reached inside a tooth. The gum-line grooves on this molar, the sign of a toothpick, run back through the human line, far beyond Neanderthals, to some of the earliest members of our genus. A reminder that worrying at a sore tooth is among the oldest things anyone did with their hands. What is new at Chagirskaya is the step past worrying, into cutting. One of the authors put it directly: discoveries like this drive the final nails into the old idea of the dull, brutish Neanderthal. The record has been filling with the opposite for years, of Neanderthals who buried their dead, made ornaments, used medicinal plants, and cared for the injured among them long enough for broken bones to knit and heal. A tooth cleaned of its rot, in a companion who then ate with it for a long time, belongs on that list. There is a proper caution to register, and the researchers register it. It is difficult to prove beyond all doubt that a hollow in an ancient tooth was made by a tool rather than by damage after death, and at least one outside specialist has noted as much. But the marks are tightly localized inside the cavity, in a way that decay and ordinary wear do not explain, and the deliberate reading is the one the evidence best supports. Then comes the detail that settles the most important question: the one this whole list has been circling. Over the grooves left by the work, on the surface of the treated tooth, are the wear marks of ordinary chewing. The individual did not simply undergo the procedure. They went on using the tooth afterward, long enough for eating to begin scuffing away the very marks the intervention had left. The operation was survived. In the most literal sense available to us across 60,000 years, it worked. Set that against everything above it. The Maya cementing jade into a living tooth, the Etruscan gold, the iron pin in the Celtic grave, the first-named dentist carved into a tomb wall, the front teeth taken at Tafaralt, the beeswax at Lens, the drilled molars of Merger, the tar fillings of Fredion, the scraped clean wisdom tooth at Villabruna. All of it is our species, and all of it is recent by comparison. The oldest of those, Villabruna, is 14,000 years old. Chagirskaya is roughly 60. It is more than 4 times older than the oldest thing Homo sapiens is known to have done to a tooth. And the hand that did it was not a human hand, as we usually mean the word. It belonged to another kind of person entirely, a Neanderthal, part of a lineage that would be extinct within a few thousand years and would leave no descendants who could tell the story. For a long time, that lineage was cast as the dull cousin of our own, incapable of the finer kinds of thought. A single molar from a Siberian cave argues otherwise. Someone recognized the source of a specific pain, understood that the rot inside a tooth could be reached and removed, selected a tool fine enough to do it, carried out the work on a companion, and did it well enough that the patient ate with the tooth for a long time after. The impulse to reach into a mouth and dig out the thing that hurts is not a mark of our species, or of farming, or of cities, or of writing. It is older than all of them, and older than us. It sits in a drawer in Siberia now, one small decayed molar, drilled clean by a person who was not quite human, 60,000 years before the first of our own kind ever picked up a stone and did the same. If you want to see more videos like this, click the video on screen now and make sure to subscribe.